Well, good morning. Welcome. If we have not yet met, my name is Linda Hobar. I am the author of The Mystery of History. And this morning, our topic is unleashing the power of world history. Now, the hope is with our back to homeschool theme, our hope is that you're going to feel inspired to teach history at home. And I want you to teach it with passion if you grew up liking history or not. Now, spoiler alert, I'm the girl that did not like history growing up. It's true. Now, let me set the stage for our time together by asking you a question. So, if my topic is unleashing world history, well, then what do you think keeps it leashed, so to speak? Now, drop your word comments in the chat box. What do you think commonly holds people back? I'm going to check over here. All right. Picture, if you will, a leash holding a really strong dog and how there's just this pull and tug of war. And I'm wondering what comes to your mind when you think of what is it that leashes people from really running freely through a field loving world history? Like the dog who wishes it could just be unleashed. Well, I will say this, by the fact that you're attending this session on world history, maybe you're not that person who avoids the subject. But what of those that do? What are those common complaints? What do you think held me back as a child? Well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to provide you a list and I'm going to pull up some slides just to help us move along. I think it's always good to learn by seeing. So let's go to a screen share, which of course, now that I have you here, I can't find. All right, let me put my glasses on, find my screen share button. It's moved since I've done this. And again, you keep putting in the chat box what you think holds people back from this subject. Okay, I have a small problem. I can't find my screen share button. Could a moderator talk to me in the box? That would be very helpful. Let's see. Well, I can talk with or without slides, and I plan to, but I'd really love for you to see my list with your own eyes. Let's see. Screen share, screen share. Not anywhere in sight. Okay, well, I'm going to keep talking. We'll come back to that. Richie, feel free to jump in and chat with me when you can. Well, I think the first thing I hear when I ask people the question, what holds you back from liking world history? The first thing I hear is that it's boring. Oh, isn't that the most common complaint? Because so many of us grew up on these dull, dry history books. The ones that provided us lots of names, dates, charts, treaties. Honestly, I feel like all that stuff is easy to memorize, but it's also easy to get lost in and forget. Number two, I have heard so many people say that this subject is pointless, at least compared to science, technology, and engineering and math. Those are the four STEM subjects, if you didn't know that. I mean, this is what I'll hear. History majors can't build computers and skyscrapers. Well, maybe that's true. But that person who's saying that just sees history as a collection of horrific events. If that's you, put pointless over in the chat box. Number three, I would go on to say that some people think that history is just too morbid for children. They see only the gloom and doom and would rather avoid it. True story, every now and then I will talk to parents who say they hesitate to teach world history because of all that blood, gore, and guts. Kind of like when you watch the local evening news. What do they show us? The bad stories. Number four, I have heard rumblings that world history is irrelevant to us today. Now, that person says, Oh, what happened thousands of years ago doesn't matter. It's just the history and story of dead people. Hmm. Jot down irrelevant if that describes you, or maybe you have a teenager that thinks that. And last, what of those who only see history as a secular subject? Now, if you attended a public school, well, then you were taught history as merely a secular subject. Honestly, I feel like that robs it of true life and of significance. So put in the box if you were public schooled. That would explain some people's experience. Truthfully, world history, I think it can be poorly taught. It could be restrained by any one of those leashes or maybe all five, which would even be the worst. But I propose to you, my friends, world history does not have to suffer under any of these restraints. No, it does not have to be a nuisance and a chore for you. So I have counterpoints and suggestions for how to unleash the power of world history at home. And once I get through these, I'm going to tell you some history stories to bring all this to life and to apply what we've learned. And you might want your kids to join you who are about age 10 and up for that last part. You could count this as a history class today.
Holds people back from really loving this subject? What leashes people? We went through what my slides suggest. I'll repeat them real quick. I hear that it's boring, pointless, morbid, irrelevant, or secular. Yeah. So now what we need to do is talk about the counterpoints. What is it that we could do? What can we do to turn this thing around? All right. Let's go to the first one. Number one, when it comes to being boring, well, it's just not true. History isn't boring, especially if you could keep it about the people. As my slide suggests, that is the key. Instead of focusing on treaties and charts, tell the story of people's lives. That's good stuff. As for being pointless, well, that's absolutely not true, especially if you can trace cause and effect. You know, cause and effect is one of the reasons why we study history, right? We need to learn from it, or we're doomed to repeat it. As for being morbid, well, first of all, let me say, I agree. History is particularly disturbing. Yeah, it really is. I've been researching and writing it for over 20 years, and at times it keeps me up at night. But you know what? When properly handled, we need to feel history. Can I get an amen on that? We need to feel because with some discretion, we need to harness the feelings it provokes because it's those very feelings that is going to help us talk to our children about the brevity of life, the sinful nature of mankind, and our need for salvation. So, yeah, unfortunately, we really need to look into the dark pages of history. Now, as for being irrelevant, well, it's just not true. We can learn from people who have lived in any time period, right? And Lord willing, just apply that to our lives. But to really counter irrelevance, all we need to do is connect it to the headlines, and that's not hard to do. History's everywhere embedded in our headlines. Now, Les, let me say, if you, again, grew up where history was only taught to you as a secular subject, well, I think you've absolutely missed the best part. It's so much more. As the old phrase goes, history is his story. We absolutely should be looking for it, like little detectives solving a case. History's the record of God's creation, it's the record of his sovereignty, and his desire to reveal himself. I admit his ways are mysterious. Sometimes it's quite tricky. But by grace, he draws us in. He draws us in our messy, morbid state towards salvation, and that's the gospel. Now, I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to see this for yourself in Scripture. So let me just read to you, listen in on a few verses on God's sovereignty that really is the backbone to history. Psalm 22:28 says, "For kingship belongs to the Lord. He rules over the nations." Or Psalm 47:8, "God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne." Or Second Chronicles 26, "Yahweh, are you not the God who is in heaven, and do you not rule over all the kingdoms of the nations?" He does. Now, as for the gospel, it is good news for mankind. And here's just a few passages stating these truths in the event that they're new to you. You know, once upon a time, these truths were new to me when I did not know the Lord. I'm never going to assume that my listeners know these biblical truths. So I'm just going to read the gospel in a nutshell. John 3:16 says, He gave His one and only Son so that everyone who believes in Him will not perish but have eternal life. Notice I put life in italics. Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates His own love for us, and that while we were still sinners, which is all of us, Christ died for us, and we shall be saved by His life. These are life-giving verses. And Romans 6:23. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. Well, I admit I probably could end my presentation right here with the principles to unleash the power of world history and with these powerful verses, but I'm not sure I would have done my job well for two reasons. Number one, we still have more time. I have been allotted 45 to 50 minutes here. And two, I would say knowledge without application isn't that useful. So here's what I want to do to show you what it looks like to unleash world history. I'm going to give you 4 pretty juicy stories found in 4 different time periods, going from the Old Testament to modern time. And please bring your kids in. Let's say if they're about 10 years old and up. This is history class today. And I say 10 and up because I will be pulling on a couple of dark stories to make some points. So this isn't for the little bitty ones. Now, my very first story to tell is coming from ancient times. So get comfortable, listen, lean in. The story is of the Battle of Marathon. Now, some of you know this story, but if you don't, here it is in a nutshell. So Darius the First, he's the king of Persia, which is ancient Iran. He wished to spread his kingdom. He wanted to include Ionia. Now, I hope you can see my mouse, but Ionia is just a little strip of land over there on the coast of Turkey. Now, he managed to conquer Ionia, but not without a very difficult fight, because the nearby Greeks over here from Athens, well, they stepped up to help their Ionian friends to fight Darius. Now, threatened by this, Darius and his army, well, they sailed over to Greece to start a fight against them. And the two armies met up at a famous location, the plain of Marathon. Now, Marathon is about 25 miles from the city of Athens. Remember that. The Persian army under Darius, I promise you they were not prepared for the fight they found at the Battle of Marathon. The Greeks surrounded the Persians on 3 sides, pushed them against the sea. The Persians wound up losing 6,000 men. The Athenians, they lost just 200. Therefore, it was an incredible victory for the Greeks, and it showed the world that these mighty Persians could be stopped. Now, tradition says that there was one Greek named Pheidippides. There's a good name. You want to say that, students? Pheidippides. And he chose to run about 25 miles to Athens to deliver news of the victory. Now, they say he had already been running messages to and from Sparta, so after he got there, he exclaimed, "Rejoice, we conquer," and then he fell down dead from pure exhaustion. Well, as you well know, in honor of that long run, we say today that a marathon is a race of about 26 miles. Or maybe a marathon is something just very difficult to do. But the story doesn't end there. I have more. Listen, world history teaches that Darius had a son named Xerxes the First. Now, Xerxes wanted nothing more than to avenge his father's loss at Marathon. And that, my friends, is something called cause and effect, right? And because Darius lost the Battle of Marathon, well, his son Xerxes, 10 years later, he set out to destroy those Greeks. He wanted to teach them a lesson. So his plan was to build this floating bridge across the Dardanelles at the Hellespont. That's just a waterway. Xerxes' army, he may have had up to 200,000, and they crossed this magnificent bridge. They had a legendary band of soldiers that they nicknamed the Immortals. I don't know what that means, but I'm kind of picturing like a zombie army. Or maybe they were very tall. Anyway, they were at first victorious. They would win the very famous Battle of Thermopylae. That's where Xerxes and his army had to face 300 Spartans. They were led by a man named Leonidas. And these 300 Spartans, well, they fought to their deaths, just trying to block the advance of Xerxes. And I am referring to the 300 Spartans that they made a movie of a few years back. By the way, that movie is not for children. Don't be misled. Now, after the Battle of Thermopylae, Xerxes headed south. He arrived in Athens, and he sacked and burned the city. Yeah, he destroyed the famous temple of Athena at the Acropolis. You might want to remember that. But Xerxes' luck would finally run out. He would approach the Battle of Salamis and lose. It's quite a crushing blow to Xerxes. They say he sat upon a hill and watched the defeat. Now listen, to continue to show you how we want to unleash world history, let's look for his story in this. Let's look for the Lord's hand. Believe it or not, this is an easy one. Here's why. Now, if you didn't know, there is a story in the Old Testament about a little girl, or young girl. Her name was Hadassah. She was later named Esther. Yes, Esther from the Old Testament. She was a Jewish orphan, and she was the cousin of Mordecai. Now, she, along with some other young ladies, was put in a beauty contest to replace the Queen of Persia, who dared to disappoint her husband, who was Ahasuerus, the king of Persia. I think you probably know this story of Esther. Ahasuerus, the king of Persia, well, he would choose Esther of all the young ladies to be his wife. Now, he does not know she's Jewish, but because she is able to ask her husband, the king, to spare the Jews because they were being targeted for destruction by a very bad man named Haman. Well, here's the amazing part of this story. You ready? Ahasuerus, the king in the Bible, he is Xerxes. It is believed they are one and the same person. Now, I don't know about you, but I think you've just got to love God's hand in history here, because Esther would win the heart of Xerxes, who was the son of Darius. The Jews of Persia were spared. I tell you what, I think seeing Xerxes first in the context of Persian history as this powerful, avenging king who actually sacked Athens, I think it makes the story of Esther just so much more. This is not just a rags to riches fairy tale from the Old Testament. No, this young woman was a real woman who risked her life to plead for her people. I do think it's a great story. Now, because I want this session to be one of application, how did we do on unleashing world history? Remember, what were our objectives? So first, was this about people? Well, yes, this is about Darius, Xerxes, Esther, and more. Is there cause and effect here? Absolutely. Darius's loss at Marathon is exactly what inspired Xerxes to attack the Greeks. All right, can you feel from this story? Oh, I know I can. It's really quite a tender story about an orphan becoming a queen. Now, does this story connect to our headlines? Well, actually it does, because the Jews of today, they are still being threatened by the Persians, because the Persians are modern day Iran, the Iranians. And last, do we see his story here? Well, I think so. You see, the Lord used Esther to spare his chosen people because he had a plan. His plan was for Christ to come through the lineage of David, who was a Jew. All right, we need to move along. Remember, I have 4 stories today, so here's number 2. We're going to turn to medieval times. And I'm going to start with the destruction of Israel. It's a gruesome story. Because you see, in AD 70, so track with me here, that's 37 years after Christ died and rose again, there was war between Jews and Romans. You probably already know from New Testament stories that the Romans ruled harshly over Judea. That was during Christ's lifetime and beyond. As a matter of fact, the reason why Christ was executed by crucifixion is because that was a Roman thing. The Romans executed that way. Well, anyway, much to the disappointment of most of the Jews, Christ didn't come to free his people from Roman oppression. No, he came to free them from their sins. So after his death and resurrection, the Jews, who still were looking for this salvation from the Romans. Well, they continued to fight the Romans. And in the very worst siege between them, the Jews would go as far as building 3 walls around Jerusalem, just trying to stop Romans. But these Romans, oh, they're pretty powerful. They have catapults, battering rams. The Romans are truly unstoppable. And under Titus, who was the son of an emperor of Rome, the Roman soldiers sacked the city of Jerusalem, the holy city. And according to Josephus, over 1 million Jews were killed. About 97,000 were captured. Now, did you know that Jesus himself would prophesy that this destruction would happen? He did. If you want to look that up, you can find it in Luke 19:41-44, and also in Luke 21:20-21. So remember that. Now, stay with me. In the course of Rome taking Jerusalem, well, the second Jewish temple was destroyed. Now, I don't mean that the temple was just toppled. No, I mean all but a few outer walls, including the famous Western Wall. Some call it the Weeping Wall. All of that was reduced to ruins except those walls. As a matter of fact, the Romans would go on and steal everything imaginable that was of value out of the temple. Then they set fire to it. They tore it down stone by stone. The large front brass doors, they were melted into a puddle. And in prideful victory, these Romans paraded down the streets, waving these priceless sacred treasures from the temple. And then they would drag Jewish prisoners behind them. It's quite a morbid story. Now in AD 82, a very famous arch was built in Rome to honor Titus for his victory over the Jews. Let me say, I'm not excited that Titus did this, but historically, well, the arch is very special. You know why? Because if you look up close, here's a zoomed in view, guess what we see? There are Roman soldiers here carrying off gold and silver trumpets right here, the table of showbread, a candelabra, other treasures of the temple which we would not otherwise have pictures of. So I kind of want to say, well, thank you, Romans, for showing off the spoils so we could see them. That little arch is still standing. Well, it's not little, it's big. You could see it today if you wanted in Rome. Well, let's keep going in our story. So without the temple in place, with tens of thousands dead, and with their homeland in ruin, the Jews are truly more than defeated, and some of them were enslaved by the Romans. They were forced to finish building the famous Colosseum that's in the city of Rome. It was started by Emperor Vespasian, finished by his son Titus. And those who survived the attack on Jerusalem, if they were lucky enough to survive, well, they're forced to settle anywhere that they could, where they could find work. And there's a name for this dispersion of the Jews to other countries. We call it the Jewish diaspora. Now, to connect all this, stay with me. Because there was war in Jerusalem, some Jews fled before the city completely fell, and one such group had a name. They were the Zealots, and they were nicknamed for zealously fighting against the Romans. And when they began to see that this fight was futile, they fled to a very extraordinary location named Masada. So some would call this next event I'm about to describe from medieval times the Siege of Masada. We're looking at about AD 66 to 73. So Masada is the name of this fortress way up here on the top. It's in the deserts of Israel. Herod the Great had remodeled it as a retreat site. You know Herod the Great. Now, this thing is out in the middle of nowhere, but I would say it was ideal for a paranoid king. He had just about everything he needed to live out there. He was always afraid someone was going to do something to him, so he went frequently. This place had carved out cisterns to store all kinds of water and food. Quite an elaborate system he had there. Now, before the Jews lost Jerusalem completely, there were, like I said, about 1,000 of these zealots who they had not converted to Christianity. They were expecting Christ to save them from the Romans, and he didn't do that, so they fled to Masada. It was this hideout. Now, for a time, I'd say, this place was perfect for them. They were well protected, and for the first time in a very long time, this group of people was free. The Romans, however, well, they weren't the least bit tolerant of these escapees. 20,000 Roman soldiers marched to Masada. They wanted to take prisoner these Jews who had dared to flee. Oh, it was a slow process for them to take Masada. The Romans built a camp, there's some ruins of it here, at the base of Masada. Then they spent months building an earthen ramp. They wanted to scale up to the fortress. I mean, they had to get there somehow. In my morbid imagination, I just picture children kind of looking over the walls of the edge of the fort and asking maybe their mom or dad, like, what's going to happen when these soldiers get here? Well, I hope that they didn't know. The leader of the zealots, he decided not to find out what would happen to them. Excuse me. They did not want to know what would happen to them in the hands of the Romans. So in the night, the men actually killed their own families. They slew their children and their wives, and they drew straws to kill each other. And then the last few committed suicide. We know some of these facts because there was a handful of women and children who chose not to participate, and they escaped to tell the story. I don't think we can imagine this kind of fear and hatred that these people had against the Romans. I mean, mass suicide just to avoid capture. It's horrific. Did you know, though, that to this day, Masada is considered a very sacred ground to the Jewish people? It is from this location that Israeli soldiers, they are actually inducted into the army. They have a slogan. The slogan is, Masada shall not fall again. Okay, now that was a tough story to get through, but how well did we do on unleashing world history? Number one, is this about people? Yes, it's about a very specific people, the Zealots, the Jews. Is there cause and effect here? Yes. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD led to this diaspora of the Jews and led to them hiding at Masada. Can you feel it? I think so. Unless you have no heart, I think it is a tragedy we feel. Can we connect it to today? Well, yes, the Israeli army is still being sworn in at Masada. And 5, can you see his hand in history? Yes, one reason why is that Jesus prophesied that Jerusalem would fall. And yes, it did. Okay, we're at our halfway point, so it's time to go into our third era, the Renaissance and Reformation. So my first story is about Girolamo Savonarola. Now that's a mouthful. If you don't want to practice saying it with me, Girolamo Savonarola. So he's a Dominican friar. He lived in Florence, Italy, at the height of the Renaissance. And when I tell his story, I will say I'm filled with very mixed feelings of both admiration and of sadness. And I'm filled with admiration because this Savonarola, well, he was unusually strong in his Christian conviction, and he preached about as passionately as John the Baptist. He sincerely loved the Lord, and he wanted to protect his city, the city of Florence, from becoming too humanistic. That was the trend at the time in the midst of the Renaissance. You see, the Renaissance, just the very word, means rebirth, and it refers to this rebirth of humanism that came from ancient Greece and Rome. In fact, to downplay humanism and paganism, Savonarola preached that others would burn their vanities. Yeah, it was called a bonfire of vanities. Oh, listen, he would encourage the masses to bring things like trinkets and riches and art or dirty books to the middle of town to burn. Ouch. I have to admit, I think he'd find a few vanities in my home because his list included cards, dice, makeup, and jewelry. Yeah, he thought that anything that contributed to vanity ought to just go up in smoke. Now, I also told you that I find this story one of sadness. And where does the sadness come from? It comes from his gruesome death. Here's what happened. Savonarola went so far with his convictions that he would fight against the Franciscan monks and the Pope of the day, who he would call a devil and a monster. Now, if truth be told, the Pope at the time, Alexander VI, He did come from the rather corrupt Borgia family, and he may go down in history as one of the most immoral popes to ever hold the office. And since he had great power, you know what he did as Savonarola would rail against him? Well, he had the man arrested, tortured, and then put to death for crying out against humanism that had crept into the church. Poor Savonarola, at just age 45, he was stripped, hanged, strangled, and burned. As a final act of cruelty, his ashes were thrown into a river. Is that gruesome? Yes, very. But I'm happy to report that Savonarola would not die in vain. There were some who listened to his message of repentance and responded. So let's transition to this happier story. I want you to meet Sandro Botticelli. The story is that he proved himself a masterful painter. So again, this is the Renaissance and painters are everywhere. He was soon employed for lots of projects by the rich and famous Medici family, a family in Florence. And since this was the Renaissance, the first projects he did were very Greek and Roman looking. Botticelli brought ancient mythology to life. Here's a few examples. He would paint Venus and Mars. He would paint Primavera. Oh, and look at how graceful these goddesses appear here. It's like you can nearly feel the wind kind of blowing their gowns and sweeping the tassels of their hair. I do think it's breathtaking, but you have Mercury holding back clouds for the ladies. You have Cupid aiming an arrow. You have a confusing scene on the right. This wind is supposedly Zephyr grasping a nymph. She morphs into Flora, a character that Ovid wrote about, who was a Roman poet. My point being, this painting is absolutely immersed in Greek and Roman mythology. Okay, after years of painting like this, Botticelli had a change of heart because he listened and responded to the preaching of our friend Savonarola. Botticelli listened, and as a result, he quit painting just about anything that had to do with mythology. And for the rest of his career, he painted scenes of the Christian faith. So here's some examples. His later works, he would do the return of Judith to Bethulia. That's an Old Testament story. And notice her gown. He would do the story of Christ with Annunciation. He would paint mystic nativity. Notice the angels up here. Don't they kind of remind you of those goddesses that he previously did in mythology? He also did Madonna of the Pomegranate with these heavenly rays coming down on the Christ child. And he did mystic Crucifixion. In every scene, it's as if he transformed those windswept goddesses into heavenly angels. And aren't they beautiful? Now, whenever you see the works of Botticelli, do ask yourself, was this painted before or after his conversion? And, dear friends, how did we do on Unleashing World History here? So, was this about people? Yes, particularly Savonarola and Botticelli. Is there cause and effect in this story? Yes. Savonarola would have so enjoyed knowing that he had influenced a major artist of the Renaissance who moved his trade from the secular to the sacred. Can you feel this story? Well, I hope you feel something when you do learn of the martyrdom of Savonarola, who stuck to his guns, preaching just holiness. Can you connect it to the headlines? Well, yes, in the sense that we still have martyrs today. There are pastors, preachers really all over our world who are preaching Christ in restricted countries. And as a result, they face imprisonment and sometimes death. And do we see his story? Well, I think any conversion demonstrates God's grace and mercy. All right, it's time to step it up. We have one of the world's worst stories coming up, and this one is straight out of modern times, not too long ago. And the story is the rise of Adolf Hitler. I imagine you've heard of him. So quickly, Hitler once boasted that the newly formed Third Reich, the one that he brought to life, he projected that it would last 1,000 years. Well, thank God he was wrong about that fact. The Third Reich of Germany lasted only 12 years and 4 months. But you know what? Because of the Holocaust being part of it, most would still label it one of the worst time periods ever known to mankind. So, just a little background on Hitler. When he was 16, he dropped out of high school, did as he pleased. He wandered around the city of Vienna in Austria. He visited operas and museums. He read, he would draw. In fact, he loved painting. He once tried to get into the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. Twice he was rejected. What a shame. I wish the art school had taken him, but they didn't. In that same year, his mother died of cancer, and I will say he was devastated, and it led to something he would describe as 5 years of misery. Now, granted, his mom is gone, he has no trade, I don't think he shows much work ethic. He suddenly finds himself penniless and homeless on the streets of Vienna. So, sure, those tough years shaped Adolf Hitler. But lest you feel too much pity for him, let me tell you what he wrote about that time. He would say, and I quote, "In this period, my eyes were opened to two menaces of which I had previously scarcely known the names, Marxism and Jewry." End quote. Yeah, menaces. Hitler believed that Jews were a menace to society. He wrongly associated all Jews with Marxism, which he believed was a growing threat to Germany. Now, if you didn't know Karl Marx, the founder of communism, he was born a Jew, thus the association of all Jews with Marxists. Now, ironically, Karl Marx would convert to atheism, but Hitler still despised him. Now, at age 24, Adolf Hitler actually tried to join the German army but failed, so he volunteered to be a messenger instead. He was wounded twice in World War I, decorated a couple of times for bravery, and promoted to corporal. But he was also hospitalized for temporary blindness that was caused by poisonous gas, which was introduced during World War I. And when he was at the hospital and it was announced that Germany had signed an armistice to end the war, Hitler just didn't deal with it. He buried his head in his hands. They say he wept. Because picture his lot in life. This man has no family, no career, no girl back home, and not a friend that we know of. He had nothing to live for but the love of war. It's kind of no wonder he would not accept the defeat of his homeland. Now, politically speaking, Germany, after World War I, it was forced to regroup. They lost World War I, so they set up something called the Weimar Republic. Some will pronounce it Weimar. And so, yes, they have a constitution, a president, a parliament, and it looked good on paper. But the system was weak, was new, young, so that meant that Germany found itself quite ripe for new political parties. Weak governments are not to be envied. And one such political party was the German Worker Party. Here's where things get interesting. Hitler, just after the war, he was sent by the German army to spy on the German Workers' Party. The government didn't like that this little party had popped up, and they wanted to know what the group was up to. Now, as fate would have it, Hitler not only spied on the German Worker Party, but he joined it. And then he resigned from the army. And after joining the German Workers' Party, Adolf Hitler seemed to have an aha moment. He discovered he had a real knack for politics. He had a real ability to speak. As he would spout off in the beer halls of Munich, he quickly learned that others would listen to him. Now, bear in mind, this young man had a long list of failures up his sleeve. He had very few friends. I suspect he couldn't help but enjoy these small crowds that would applaud him, especially the angrier he got. He was famous for these fury-filled speeches. Now pay close attention to this next fact. It was in 1920 that the German Worker Party renamed itself the National Socialist Party, which when shortened is Nazi. I think you know where we're headed with this. Oh, the town squares were absolutely packed when Adolf Hitler took the microphone. He was a master of propaganda. Beware of propaganda. He would rattle on and on to his listeners, about the need for Germans to save the fatherland. Remember, they were defeated in World War I. So he publicly blamed Marxists and Jews for all the economic woes of Germany, which had been hit very hard with some reparations after World War I. Now, he actually attempted a coup and was arrested for that in 1923. But you know what they did? They sentenced him to 5 years of prison, which he didn't spend. He only spent 9 months there. And strangely, that time became to his advantage. He's pictured here with his entourage, and the trial wound up giving him publicity and national fame. And then he used those 9 months in prison to write a little book. Perhaps you've heard of it, called Mein Kampf. It's just this rambling mixture of his autobiography, his mission, and the title means My Struggle. It refers to Hitler's struggle to try to build a pure German race. Oh, it was actually quite convoluted. Now, upon Hitler's release from jail, he moved full force, trying to convert Germany to this fascist Nazi state. And he wanted to build a private army of soldiers. Now, they had a name. They were the famous Schutzstaffel, nicknamed the SS. And I'm pretty sure you know the symbol they adopted. And they sewed it on every uniform. That was, of course, the swastika. He only borrowed it from history. He didn't invent it. He only designed the one on the bottom right of your screen. Now, in 1932, Hitler ran for president but was defeated. 1 year later, though, he maneuvered the then president. This was Paul von Hindenburg, which, by the way, yes, the famous Hindenburg Zeppelin that exploded and caught on fire, was named after him. So Hindenburg was a World War I general. He's the president of Germany. And Hitler will say, why don't you make me chancellor, which is the head of the Reichstag? That's one branch of the parliament in this Weimar Republic. Oh, friends, had Hitler stopped there just to be a chancellor, well, maybe history would be different. But that's not enough for him. He pressed on, and most believe he created an imaginary crisis. It's believed that he and the SS would set fire to the Reichstag in March of 1933 and then blame it on the communists. Yeah, he burned up a building, so we think. And then Hitler would use that incident to say, oh, I need some special powers. And he starts with the one called the Decree for the Protection of the People in the State. Oh, how awfully misleading. This is actually the opening of Pandora's box. All other political parties in Germany were ransacked, disbanded, members mysteriously disappeared. Then Hitler took more power within just weeks of that fire, and he tampered with the Constitution. It was something called the Enabling Act. Oh, and this allowed him to pass laws without the parliament, without the Reichstag, for 4 years. Oh, legally, this set him up to be a dictator. But just in case that wasn't quite enough security for him, wouldn't you know, just one day before the president's natural death, the Nazis conveniently passed a law called the German Referendum. It would mesh the position of president and chancellor into one. Who was chancellor? Hitler was. So with the death of Germany's president in 1934, and with the merger of these positions, Hitler, at this pivotal moment in history, he would become the highest leader in Germany. Friends, was there a civil war? No. Was there an election? No. Was there a coup? No. He just made this happen by tampering with the Constitution. Hitler's placement would appear legal. Isn't that sad? Because I know you know where this story goes. So as head of state, he becomes commander-in-chief. He adopts the title Der Führer. It means the leader. And like Caesar of ancient time, he wanted to be addressed and saluted with a hail. Now in German, that would be the familiar Heil Hitler. And the results of his rise to power? The Holocaust, which I do not need to belabor here, but in a nutshell, 11 to 17 million suffered the pain of death under Hitler. There's a list of the victims. It was far more than the Jews, though they would suffer the greatest loss of 6 million. Now, the only good news to end this story is the fact that Hitler was stopped. It was going to take World War II to stop him, but it did happen. He would commit suicide on April 30th, 1945. And with his death did come the end of the Holocaust. In fact, in the year 1945, during those final months of World War II, all those who had been left behind in scattered concentration camps, they were liberated. And today we tend to focus on remembering and listening to the few that are still alive to tell the story. Okay, how did we do on unleashing world history on this story? First, is this about people? Yeah, 11 to 17 million of them. Is there cause and effect? Yes. Had Hitler not taken power by overwriting the Constitution of Germany, he may not have orchestrated the Holocaust. Can we feel from this story? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we feel headlines like this today. North Korea has concentration camps, and other countries. Can we find his story in this dark piece of history? Well, I will say that's a hard one. But because the Third Reich fell after 12 years and 4 months, I think we can see God's mercy. Well, that concludes Unleashing the Power of World History. I hope it has indeed inspired you to consider the importance of history, the significance of it, the intrigue of it, if you grew up enjoying the subject or not. And if you need materials to help you bring history to life, and if you liked my stories, well, I do have 4 volumes of history. They're for all ages, so they do grow harder. And I have audiobooks for those busy days. I also want you to know I have lectures and self-paced classes that I offer. These are particularly designed for your middle schooler or high schooler. And I lecture much like what you heard today. The self-paced class, it actually offers daily lesson plans for those of you that just need a teacher to come alongside. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I believe later I'll be able to see questions in the chat box, so I'll be happy to peek, ask any question that you're interested in. I want to say thank you to Richie Swords, who pulls us all together to inspire us for such a time as this. I'm so excited to see this growth in the homeschool movement. You guys, it's not easy, but it's rewarding and it's worth it. And as history will teach us, our liberty is at stake. So pour into your children. Don't miss this opportunity in time. Thank you for the sake of the mystery. I'm Linda Hobar.